George Armstrong Custer was a United States Army officer and cavalry commander in the American Civil War and the American Indian Wars. Raised in Michigan and Ohio, Custer was admitted to West Point in 1857, where he graduated last in his class in 1861. With the outbreak of the Civil War, Custer was called to serve with the Union Army. Custer developed a strong reputation during the Civil War. He participated in the first major engagement, the First Battle of Bull Run on July 21, 1861, near Washington, D.C. His association with several important officers helped his career, as did his success as a highly effective cavalry commander. Custer was promoted to captain in 1864, and was brevetted to major general in 1865. At the conclusion of the Appomattox campaign, in which he and his troops played a decisive role, Custer was present at General Robert E. Lee's surrender to General Ulysses S. Grant on April 9, 1865. After the Civil War, Custer remained a major general in the United States Volunteers until they were mustered out in February 1866. He reverted to his permanent rank of captain and was appointed a lieutenant colonel in the 7th Cavalry Regiment in July 1866. He was dispatched to the West in 1867 to fight in the American Indian Wars. On June 25, 1876, while leading the 7th Cavalry Regiment at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in Montana Territory against a coalition of Native American tribes, he and all of his regiment, which included 2 of his brothers, were killed. The battle is popularly known in American history as Custer's Last Stand. Custer and his regiment were defeated so decisively at the Little Bighorn that it has overshadowed all of his prior achievements. Family and ancestry. Custer's ancestors, Paulus and Gertrude Custer, emigrated to North America around 1693 from the Rhineland in Germany, probably among thousands of Palatine refugees whose passage was arranged by the English government to gain settlers. According to family letters, Custer was named after George Armstrong, a minister, in his devout mother's hope that her son might join the clergy. Birth, siblings and nicknames. Custer was born in New Rumley, Ohio, to Emmanuel Henry Custer, a farmer and blacksmith, and Marie Ward Kirkpatrick. He had 2 younger brothers, Thomas Custer and Boston Custer, who both died with him on the battlefield at Little Bighorn. His other full siblings were the family's youngest child, Margaret Custer, and Nevin Custer, who suffered from asthma and rheumatism. Custer also had several older half-siblings. Throughout his life, Custer was known by a variety of nicknames. He was called Orty and Armstrong. During the Civil War, Custer was frequently termed the Boy General in the press, reflecting his promotion to Brigadier General at the age of 23 during his years on the Great Plains in the American Indian Wars. His troopers often referred to him with grudging admiration as Iron Butt and Hard-Ass for his physical stamina in the saddle and his strict discipline, as well as with the more derisive ringlets for his vanity about his appearance in general and his long, curling blonde hair in particular. Early life. Custer spent much of his boyhood living with his half-sister and brother-in-law in Monroe, Michigan, where he attended school. Before entering the United States Military Academy, Custer attended the McNeely Normal School, later known as Hopedale Normal College, in Hopedale, Ohio. While attending Hopedale, Custer, together with classmate William Enos Emery, was known to have carried coal to help pay for the room and board. After graduating from McNeely Normal School in 1856, Custer taught school in Cadiz, Ohio. Custer entered West Point as a cadet on July 1, 1857, to become a member of the class of 1862. At the time, West Point's course of study was 5 years long. With the outbreak of the American Civil War, the course was shortened to 4 years, allowing Custer and his class to graduate on June 24, 1861. He was last in a class of 34 cadets. Throughout his life, Custer tested boundaries and rules. In his 4 years at West Point, he amassed a record total of 726 demerits, one of the worst conduct records in the history of the Academy. A fellow cadet recalled Custer as declaring there were only 2 places in a class, the head and the foot, and since he had no desire to be the head, he aspired to be the foot. A roommate noted, "It was all right with George Custer, whether he knew his lesson or not. He simply did not allow it to trouble him." Quote, "Under ordinary national conditions, Custer's low-class rank would represent a ticket to an obscure posting. But Custer had the ironic fortune to graduate as the Civil War broke out. During his rocky tenure at the Academy, Custer came close to expulsion in each of his 3 years due to excessive demerits. Many of these were awarded for pulling pranks on fellow cadets." Civil War. McClellan and Pleasanton. Custer was commissioned a second lieutenant in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry Regiment and was assigned to drilling volunteers in Washington, D.C. On July 21, 1861, he was with his regiment at the First Battle of Bull Run during the Manassas Campaign, where Army Commander Winfield Scott detailed him to carry messages to Major General Irvin McDowell. After the battle, he continued participating in the defenses of Washington, D.C. until October, when he was sick and absent from his unit until February 1862. In March, he participated with the 2nd Cavalry in the Peninsula Campaign in Virginia until April 4. On April 5, he served in the 5th Cavalry Regiment and participated in the Siege of Yorktown from April 5 to May 4 and was aide to Major General George B. McClellan. McClellan was in command of the Army of the Potomac during the Peninsula Campaign. On May 24, 1862, during the pursuit of Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston up the peninsula, when General Barnard and his staff were reconnoitering a potential crossing point on the Chickahominy River, they stopped, and Custer overheard his commander mutter to himself, "I wish I knew how deep it is." Custer dashed forward on his horse out to the middle of the river and turned to the astonished officers of the staff and shouted triumphantly, "That's how deep it is, Mr. General." Custer then was allowed to lead an attack with 4 companies of the 4th Michigan Infantry across the Chickahominy River above New Bridge. The attack was successful, resulting in the capture of 50 Confederate soldiers and the seizing of the first Confederate battle flag of the war. McClellan termed it a very gallant affair and congratulated Custer personally. In his role as aide-de-camp to McClellan, Custer began his lifelong pursuit of publicity. Custer was promoted to the rank of captain on June 5, 1862. On July 17, he was reverted to the rank of first lieutenant. He participated in the Maryland Campaign in September to October, the Battle of South Mountain on September 14, the Battle of Antietam on September 17, and the March to Warrenton, Virginia in October. On June 9, 1863, Custer became aide to Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Pleasanton, who was now commanding the Cavalry Corps, Army of the Potomac. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, Pleasanton's first assignment was to locate the army of Robert E. Lee, moving north through the Shenandoah Valley in the beginning of the Gettysburg Campaign. Brigade Commander in Gettysburg, Pleasanton was promoted on June 22, 1863 to Major General of U.S. Volunteers. On June 29, 2 days prior to the Battle of Gettysburg, Pleasanton promoted Custer to Brigadier General of Volunteers, commanding the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. Despite having no direct command experience, Custer became one of the youngest generals in the Union Army at age 23. Two other captains, Wesley Merritt and Elon J. Farnsworth, were promoted along with Custer, although they did have command experience. Custer lost no time in implanting his aggressive character on his brigade, part of the division of Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick. He fought against the Confederate cavalry of Major General J. E. B. Stuart at Hanover and Hunterstown, on the way to the main event at Gettysburg. In his first command, Custer affected a showy, personalized uniform style that alienated his men, but he won them over with his readiness to lead attacks from the front. His men began to adopt elements of his uniform, especially the red neckerchief. Custer distinguished himself by fearless, aggressive actions in some of the numerous cavalry engagements that started off the campaign, beginning with the Battle of Aldie on June 17. Pleasanton was Custer's introduction to the world of extravagant uniforms and political maneuvering, and the young lieutenant had become his protégé, serving on Pleasanton's staff. Custer was quoted as saying that, "No father could love his son more than General Pleasanton loves me." Custer's style of battle was often claimed to be reckless or foolhardy, but military planning was always the basis of every Custer dash. As Marguerite Merrington explains in the Custer Story in Letters, George Custer meticulously scouted every battlefield, gauged the enemy's weak points and strengths, ascertained the best line of attack, and only after he was satisfied was the Custer dash, with a Michigan yell, focused with complete surprise on the enemy, enrouting them every time. One of his greatest attributes during the Civil War was what Custer wrote of as luck, and he needed it to survive some of these charges. Custer established a reputation as an aggressive cavalry brigade commander willing to take personal risks by leading his Michigan brigade into battle, such as the mounted charges at Hunterstown and East Cavalry Field at the Battle of Gettysburg. At Hunterstown, in an ill-considered charge ordered by Kilpatrick against the brigade of Wade Hampton, Custer fell from his wounded horse directly before the enemy and became the target of numerous enemy rifles. He was rescued by Private Norval Francis Churchill of the 1st Michigan Cavalry, who galloped up, shot Custer's nearest assailant, and allowed Custer to mount behind him for a dash to safety. One of Custer's finest hours in the Civil War occurred just east of Gettysburg on July 3, 1863. In conjunction with Pickett's charge to the west, Robert E. Lee had dispatched Stuart's cavalry on a mission into the rear of the Union Army. Custer encountered the Union Cavalry Division of Brigadier General David McMurtry Gregg directly in the path of Stuart's horsemen. He convinced Gregg to allow him to stay and fight, while his own division was stationed to the south out of the action. At East Cavalry Field, hours of charges and hand-to-hand combat ensued. Custer led a mounted charge of the 1st Michigan Cavalry, breaking the back of the Confederate assault. Custer's brigade lost 257 men at Gettysburg, the highest loss of any Union cavalry brigade. "I challenged the annals of warfare to produce a more brilliant or successful charge of cavalry," Custer wrote in his report. On July 3, he received the rank of brevet major for gallant and meritorious services at the Battle of Gettysburg. Custer was wounded during action at the Battle of Culpeper Courthouse in Virginia on September 13. Marriage: Custer married Elizabeth Clift Bacon on February 9, 1864. He had been socially introduced to her in November 1862. When home in Monroe on leave, she was not initially impressed with him, and her father, Judge Daniel Bacon, disapproved of Custer as a match because he was the son of a blacksmith. It was not until well after Custer had been promoted to the rank of Brevet Brigadier General that he gained the approval of Judge Bacon. He married Elizabeth Bacon 14 months after they formally finally met, in November 1868. Following the Battle of Washita River, Custer was alleged to have unofficially married Mona Shatar, daughter of the Cheyenne chief Little Rock, in the winter or early spring of 1868 to 1869. Mona Shatar gave birth to a child in January 1869, 2 months after the Washita Battle. Cheyenne oral history tells that she also bore a second child, fathered by Custer, in late 1869. Some historians, however, believe that Custer had become sterile after contracting gonorrhea while at West Point, and that the father was, in actuality, his brother Thomas, a descendant of the second child, who goes by the name Gail Custer, wrote a book about the affair, The Valley in Appomattox, in 1864, with the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac reorganized under the command of Major General Philip Sheridan. Custer led his Wolverines to the Shenandoah Valley, where by the year's end they defeated the army of Confederate Lieutenant General Jubal A. Early in the Valley campaigns of 1864. During May and June, Sheridan and Custer took part in cavalry actions supporting the Overland Campaign, including the Battle of the Wilderness, and the Battle of Yellow Tavern. In the largest all-cavalry engagement of the war, the Battle of Trevilian Station, in which Sheridan sought to destroy the Virginia Central Railroad and the Confederates' western resupply route, Custer captured Hampton's divisional train, but was then cut off and suffered heavy losses before being relieved, when Lieutenant General Early was then ordered to move down the Shenandoah Valley and threaten Washington, D.C. Custer's division was again dispatched under Sheridan. In the Valley campaigns of 1864, they pursued the Confederates at the Third Battle of Winchester and effectively destroyed Early's army during Sheridan's counterattack at Cedar Creek. Sheridan and Custer, having defeated Early, returned to the main Union Army lines at the Siege of Petersburg, where they spent the winter. In April 1865, the Confederate lines finally broke, and Robert E. Lee began his retreat to Appomattox Courthouse, pursued by the Union cavalry. Custer distinguished himself by his actions at Waynesboro, Dinwiddie Courthouse, and Five Forks. His division blocked Lee's retreat on its final day and received the first flag of truce from the Confederate force. Custer was present at the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, and the table upon which the surrender was signed was presented to him as a gift for his wife by General Philip Sheridan, who included a note to her praising Custer's gallantry. She treasured the gift of the historical table, which is now in the Smithsonian Institution. Before the close of the war, Custer received brevet promotions to Brigadier General and Major General on March 13, 1865, in the regular army, and Major General of Volunteers on April 15, 1865. As with most wartime promotions, even when issued under the regular army, these senior ranks were only temporary. On April 25, after the war officially ended, Custer had his men search for, then illegally seize, a large prize racehorse, Don Juan, near Clarksville, Virginia, worth then an estimated $10,000, along with his written pedigree. Custer rode Don Juan in the Grand Review Victory Parade in Washington, D.C. on May 23, creating a sensation when the scared thoroughbred bolted. The owner, Richard Gaines, wrote to General Grant, who then ordered Custer to return the horse to Gaines, but he did not, instead hiding the horse and winning a race with it the next year, before the horse died suddenly. Promotions and ranks. Custer's promotions and ranks, including his 6 brevet promotions, which were all for gallant and meritorious services at 5 different battles, and 1 Campaign, 2nd Lieutenant, 2nd Cavalry, 1st Lieutenant, 5th Cavalry, Captain Staff, Additional Aide-de-Camp, Brigadier General, U.S. Volunteers, Brevet Major, July 3, 1863 Captain, 5th Cavalry, Brevet Lieutenant Colonel, May 11, 1864 Brevet Colonel, Brevet Major General, U.S. Volunteers, October 19, 1864 Brevet Brigadier General, U.S. Army, March 13, 1865 Brevet Major General, U.S. Army, March 13, 1865. Major General, U.S. Volunteers, mustered out of volunteer service, Lieutenant Colonel, 7th Cavalry, July 28, 1866 Reconstruction duties in Texas. On June 3, 1865, at Sheridan's behest, Major General Custer accepted command of the 2nd Division of Cavalry, Military Division of the Southwest, to march from Alexandria, Louisiana, to Hempstead, Texas, as part of the Union occupation forces. Custer arrived at Alexandria on June 27 and began assembling his units, which took more than a month to gather and remount. On July 17, he assumed command of the Cavalry Division of the Military Division of the Gulf, and accompanied by his wife, he led the division to Texas on an arduous 18-day march in August. On October 27, the division departed to Austin. On October 29, Custer moved the division from Hempstead to Austin, arriving on November 4. Major General Custer became Chief of Cavalry of the Department of Texas, from November 13 to February 1, 1866, succeeding Major General Wesley Merritt. During his entire period of command of the division, Custer encountered considerable friction and near mutiny from the volunteer cavalry regiments who had campaigned along the Gulf Coast. They desired to be mustered out of federal service rather than continue campaigning, resented imposition of discipline, and considered Custer nothing more than a vain dandy. Custer's division was mustered out beginning in November 1865, replaced by the regulars of the U.S. 6th Cavalry Regiment. Although their occupation of Austin had apparently been pleasant, many veterans harbored deep resentments against Custer, particularly in the 2nd Wisconsin Cavalry, because of his attempts to maintain discipline. Upon its mustering out, several members planned to ambush Custer, but he was warned the night before and the attempt thwarted. American Indian Wars. On February 1, 1866, Major General Custer mustered out of the U.S. Volunteer Service and took an extended leave of absence and awaited orders to September 24. He explored options in New York City, where he considered careers in railroads and mining, offered a position as Adjutant General of the Army of Benito Juárez of Mexico, who was then in a struggle with the Mexican Emperor Maximilian I. Custer applied for a one-year leave of absence from the U.S. Army, which was endorsed by Grant and Secretary of War Stanton, Sheridan and Mrs. Custer disapproved, however, and when his request for leave was opposed by U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward, who was against having an American officer commanding foreign troops, Custer refused the alternative of resignation from the Army to take the lucrative post. Following the death of his father-in-law in May 1866, Custer returned to Monroe, Michigan, where he considered running for Congress. He took part in public discussion over the treatment of the American South in the aftermath of the Civil War, advocating a policy of moderation. He was named head of the Soldiers and Sailors Union, regarded as a response to the hyper-partisan Third Army of the Republic. Also formed in 1866, it was led by Republican activist John Alexander Logan. In September 1866, Custer accompanied President Lieutenant Andrew Johnson on a journey by train known as the Swing Around the Circle to build up public support for Johnson's policies towards the South. Custer denied a charge by the newspapers that Johnson had promised him a colonel's commission in return for his support, but Custer had written to Johnson some weeks before seeking such a commission. Custer and his wife stayed with the president during most of the trip. At one point, Custer confronted a small group of Ohio men who repeatedly jeered Johnson, saying to them, "I was born 2.5 miles from here, but I'm ashamed of you." On July 28, 1866, Custer was appointed lieutenant colonel of the newly created 7th Cavalry Regiment, which was headquartered at Fort Riley, Kansas. He served on frontier duty at Fort Riley from October 18 to March 26, and scouted in Kansas and Colorado to July 28, 1867. He took part in Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's expedition against the Cheyenne. On June 26, Lt. Lyman Kidder's party, made up of 10 troopers and 1 scout, were massacred while en route to Fort Wallace. Lt. Kidder was to deliver dispatches to Custer from General Sherman, but his party was attacked by Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne. Days later, Custer and a search party found the bodies of Kidder's patrol. Following the Hancock campaign, Custer was arrested and suspended at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas to August 12, 1868 for being AWOL, after having abandoned his post to see his wife. At the request of Major General Sheridan, who wanted Custer for his planned winter campaign against the Cheyenne, Custer was allowed to return to duty before his 1-year term of suspension had expired and joined his regiment to October 7, 1868. He then went on frontier duty, scouting in Kansas and Indian Territory to October 1869. Under Sheridan's orders, Custer took part in establishing Camp Supply in Indian Territory in early November 1868 as a supply base for the winter campaign. On November 27, 1868, Custer led the 7th Cavalry Regiment in an attack on the Cheyenne encampment of Chief Black Kettle, the Battle of Washita River. Custer reported killing 103 warriors and some women and children. 53 women and children were taken as prisoners. Estimates by the Cheyenne of the casualties were substantially lower. Custer had his men shoot most of the 875 Indian ponies they had captured. The Battle of Washita River was regarded as the first substantial U.S. victory in the Southern Plains War, and it helped force a significant portion of the Southern Cheyenne onto a U.S. assigned reservation. In 1873, Custer was sent to the Dakota Territory to protect a railroad survey party against the Lakota. On August 4, 1873, near the Tongue River, Custer and the 7th Cavalry Regiment clashed for the first time with the Lakota. 1 man on each side was killed. In 1874, Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills and announced the discovery of gold on French Creek near present-day Custer, South Dakota. Custer's announcement triggered the Black Hills gold rush. Among the towns that immediately grew up was Deadwood, South Dakota, notorious for lawlessness.